I've turned off everybody's microphones for the time being, so if you want to communicate, ask a question or whatever, use the chat feature, which is the little cartoon bubble looking thing somewhere around your frame window. And you can send messages, questions, comments, whatever along the way. And let's see, I need to share the screen. And there we go. Okay, we're underway. And thanks again for those of you joining in. This is our God is Good series that we're doing. This is now the third week. Can you imagine that? It's kind of amazing. It's gone that fast. And tonight, of course, we're talking about Noah's Ark and a little bit about the city of Babel, or the Tower of Babel, as it's more commonly referred to as. And again, we'll note the sources of what we're dealing with. It's really the two Prager books, first on Genesis, which we'll finish next week, and then Exodus for the Moses, Ten Commandments, and the Tabernacle. So that's what we're using. All the sources that he uses are acknowledged in his books, and I just put on here that I use that Safaria.org for copying the translations, the verses into these slides to the extent that they're on here. And you probably will figure out very fast we're not going. The first two classes, we kind of went verse by verse. We're going to be giving that up more and more. Tonight some, and next time a great deal, because we just don't have enough time to go verse by verse. So much more coverage. Okay, so at the beginning of chapter 6 in Genesis, it's where the flood/Noah story starts. And this first couple of verses are really kind of off the wall in a way. When man began to increase on earth and daughters were born to them, the divine beings saw how beautiful the daughters of men were and took wives from among those that pleased him. The word in Hebrew, the Hebrew words for divine beings, it's translated here as divine beings, could also be translated as sons of gods. And we really don't know what exactly the Torah is talking about here. It could well be that this is a teaching to the early peoples, the ancient peoples, that there are not lots of little gods, but rather one true God. Remember, that was sort of a theme in the creation story. This is a one God, created everything. There aren't all these little gods and nature gods and so on and so forth. This also could be one of those things in the Bible that were much better understood by the people of the day, meaning the ancient peoples, and not so well understood by us this day or today. But probably the main point is, and particularly coming before the flood story, the notion of you being like God is not what God has in mind. There is only one God, and you are not him. You're made in his image, but you are not him. Remember we talked about a little bit about lifespans at the end of last session, I think it was. Well, here God mentions, my breath shall not abide in man forever, since he too is flesh. Let the days allowed him be 120 years. We talked a little bit about the fact that the biblical references, particularly like Methuselah, are hundreds and hundreds of years people were living, which may or may not be literally true. But interestingly enough, here is God suggesting or saying that he's going to put a cap on this at roughly 120 years. It's an interesting notion. And as you recall, there is an argument that the longer you let individuals live, the more likely evil is going to happen. And if there's anything that God is all about in the Torah. It is fighting evil, having men do good. Now we're here at another verse which is sort of weird, particularly for us today. It was then and later too that the Nephilim appeared on earth when the divine beings cohabitated with the daughters of men who bore them offspring. They were the heroes of old, the men of renown. That's obviously a fake picture with that huge skull there in it. But we don't really know what's going on here exactly. This might be another thing that made more sense to the ancient people, whatever their cultural stories were about such things. We don't know hardly anything about these Nephilim other than the fact that they were giants, or the notion that they were giants. And interestingly enough, there are some biblical stories that are not so neatly contained in one area. Like the flood story is here, the creation story is there, the Exodus is here. The stories related to the Nephilim, these giants, is a story that's told throughout the Old Testament, sort of one little snippet at a time, and sometimes very separated by a great deal of time. Moses, for instance, he sends scouts to see giants 1,000 years later after this. Goliath may have been one of the last giants years after that. And when we know our Bible well, we come across these things about giants, and we know, oh yeah, I remember those. They play out in a role later, like also in the wilderness, when Moses was with the Hebrew people in the wilderness. We know that Joshua defeats giants, and it may well be that David killed the most famous one of all, meaning Goliath. So that's sort of the stuff that Prager throws out in terms of explaining what this may or may not be about. And you should also note, too, that the very last phrase, men of renown, that is not meant to indicate or suggest any positive connotation. Sometimes in modern English we have, if you are renowned, there's sort of a good notion to it. Here it just means they're well known, not in any good or bad sense. The Lord saw how great was man's wickedness on the earth, and how every plan devised by his mind was nothing but evil all the time. And that sign there, good choices, bad choices. There are Hebrew words used in this verse, yetzer, which is sometimes translated as plan, here how every plan devised. It also can be translated as urge or impulse. Freud would say that the id is these urges, primal drives and instincts. And Judaism holds that man has both good urges and evil urges, and they're always in conflict, but that we need both. We do a variety of things for mixed reasons, including good and bad. So both urges need to be controlled, and you could even argue that it's the good urge that needs to be controlled more. It gets us into more trouble. It's the notion of good intentions versus actually good behavior, or something that leads to the good as opposed to the evil. And that's a key thing. Remember, I think we talked about this last week, somewhere along the line. God judges actions. He doesn't judge thoughts, intents, or urges. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on earth, and his heart was saddened. This is an interesting notion, God regretting something. Did he not know how it would turn out? Could he not see where the future was headed? And maybe not. If you're accounting for or allowing for free will of man, God may not be able to tell exactly how things are going to go. He may not know the future when it comes to what man has to do. Some people have argued that God might be the most tragic figure in the Bible, at least the Old Testament for sure. And certainly here, repeatedly disappointed by his favorite creature, man, he to the extent that he decides to destroy the world, and it's more out of sadness, as it says here, than it is out of regret or not regret, out of anger, more out of sadness than out of anger. God does get angry in other stories, but here he's just sad. Another sort of topic or thing that comes up looking at this, does God have emotions? Does this Lord regretted suggest that God has emotions? Prager's answer to that is, given that we are made in God's image, why would we have something that God does not? The Lord said, I will blot out from the earth the men whom I have created, men together with beasts, creeping things, and birds of the sky, for I regret that I made them. Does this point to a mean-spirited God? It's often a finger-pointing sort of thing that says, look at what your God did. It's very mean-spirited. And Prager would say no. This points to a God who's obsessed with goodness. And he simply can't stand to have man go off into such an evil world. And that's why the flood, widespread human cruelty. But God did save one righteous man and his family, which sort of begs the question, why didn't God destroy all men and women, all of mankind? But it's an interesting question. He saved the most righteous that he could find. Even when his family came endless suffering through today. I mean, Noah's family, down through the ages, we'll see this later on. Endless suffering, endless problems, all kinds of things. God doesn't really explain here why the destruction of man. But we do know that God hates human cruelty. So that's clearly one reason why this is all happening. Some ask, why destroy the animals? And probably the fair question is, we really don't know. They were clearly innocent. Maybe there was just not a way to provide that many boats, or why. Maybe it's a notion of why would you need animals if there aren't any men around? One of the problems here is if you place equal value on an animal's life as a human's, there probably isn't a good answer here for you. The Bible is definitely anthropocentric, not animals. But Noah found favor with the Lord. This is the line of Noah. Noah was a righteous man. He was blameless in his age. Noah walked with God. The Hebrew word tzaddik is righteous man, just and innocent. In his age is an important phrase in this particular verse. And it could be looked at in several ways. Maybe Noah was just an average guy when it came to being quote-unquote righteous, but he stood out because everybody else was so much worse. That's one possibility. Another possibility is maybe he really did stand up as a monument to righteousness, so to speak, which would even looked more in stark contrast to the world of evil around. It's very difficult to be decent if you live among indecent people. Another thing about in his age, one of the things that God is trying to share with us, I think, here is the notion that we can only judge a person by the standards of their day, not our day. God judged him in his age and found him righteous. Sort of a current event sort of way to look at that is the fact that it is immoral to judge our founding fathers and their issues with slavery based on our standards today. At the time, virtually every society on the planet had slavery, and it was those same fathers that laid the groundwork to eventually abolish slavery less than 100 years later. So one of the keys here is people should be judged in their own age, in their own time. The biblical flood story was unprecedented, not in the sense that there weren't other flood stories in national histories and cultural histories and civilization histories, but this was the only one based on ethical monotheism. God is moral, and God demands moral behavior. Most of the other flood stories of ancient societies were based on little or nothing at all to do with fighting evil. Often it was to save a single person because they were wealthy or handsome or some sort of demigod. One flood story was because a man was making too much noise. We'd be flooded out all the time if that were the case. So the point here is, whether you believe the literal story or not isn't the point. The fact that the Torah makes its flood story about destroying evil, that's the point. Another thing that was new about the flood story and Noah, different from all the other histories and cultures that were about at the time, was that unlike national gods of other cultures, the God of the Torah was concerned about the entire world. He wasn't just concerned about where Noah lived or any other ethnic, race, whatever. It was about the entire world. Most, if not all, of other stories were very nationalistic, really only dealing with the people of their culture or what have you. God said to Noah, I have decided to put an end to all flesh, for the earth is filled with lawlessness because of them. I'm about to destroy them with the earth. Here's another contrast with other flood stories, where the gods, small g, kept their plans secret. God, capital G, confides in Noah. Another point to make, God's confidence in him when deciding if Noah was in fact really tzaddik, righteous or not. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make it an ark with compartments and cover it inside and out with pitch. This word ark is interesting here. In the Hebrew, tavah, T-E-V-A-H, is the transliteration. It's the same word that was used to describe Moses's, or will be used to describe Moses's rescue basket in the Nile. And in both stories, this kind of ark is steered by God. Unlike other boats, an ark, a tavah, is steered by God. And just interestingly enough, we have no idea what gopher wood was. This is the only known use of the word in the Bible, and in fact anywhere else in Semitic languages. So I guess it's the nature of that particular wood is lost. Here's a picture of a replica of the ark that's in the Netherlands. And if you take those dimensions as referenced in the scripture, 300 cubits, 50 cubits, and 30 cubits, you end up with a boat that's about 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet tall, with a displacement in the water of about 43,000 tons, which is interesting. That's pretty darn big. There are battleships that have similar displacements. It's about half the size, displacement-wise, as the Queen Mary. So it was a big ship. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall enter the ark with your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives. God tells Noah to take only his family. The rest of mankind, he mistrusts their moral character. That's probably the polite way of saying it. And it was only necessary to take land animals. Water-dwelling creatures were not in peril. So they did that. I was surprised, and the reason this picture on the right is here, it's a poster of a movie called Noah that was made in 2014, I think. And I watched it the other day. I missed it entirely. I had no idea it had been made or been released or anything. It's a pretty good movie. It has a cast of thousands: Russell Crowe, Anthony Hopkins, Emma, what's her name? Lots of great actors, and they did a pretty good job. And it really does stick fairly well to the narrative in the Bible. One thing that was shockingly different or impressive, whatever, was the depiction of these giants. They look more like rock robots than giant people, but that's neither here nor there. If you get a chance to watch the movie, I would recommend it to you. Noah did so, just as God commanded him. So he did. Which begs the question, why didn't Noah argue with God? It's an interesting question. After Moses and Abraham, they did their share of arguing with God. Abraham in particular, which we'll talk about next week, arguing with God about saving Sodom and Gomorrah. In this case, if the world was really as evil as God says, and if Noah knew that, then why would he argue? I mean, you could even point to the fact that Abraham, though he argued, once he knew that there weren't even 10 good people in Sodom, in the city of Sodom, then he basically acquiesced as well. So it could be as simple as that. Of every clean animal, you should take 7 pairs, males and their mates, and of every animal that is not clean, 2, a male and its mate. So this was kind of a surprise to me in the sense that I didn't remember anything besides 2 by 2, which I guess is what you get drilled into in Sunday school and so on. How many of you remember that of the clean animals, meaning animals that were appropriate for sacrifice, that you took 7 pairs of each of those so that you would have some that you could sacrifice without losing the species? The rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and thus they that entered comprised male and female of all flesh, as God had commanded him. And the Lord shut him in. In the Bible, of course, 40 is considered an indication of something very important, even divine. And there's other numbers, 7 and 7 times 7 and 7 times 10, that are important numbers, divine numbers, things you should remember. If they aren't, it would be an awful, amazing coincidence that there were so many things that were 40 years or 40 days or 7 this or 7 times 10 that. Another thing that is important to note here is that God shut the door, not Noah, not anybody else on the ship. It is God who is in control of this. God isn't letting man, meaning Noah and his family, take any of the blame for this. And when the waters had swelled on the earth 150 days, this is 150 days more or in addition to the 40 days that it rained, and we're still not done. This happens over a much longer period of time than I remember thinking. Rains for 40 days and 40 nights, and then pretty soon you're on the mountain. And so, no, it actually takes the better part of 10 months before it's all over. God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the cattle that were with him in the ark, and God caused a wind to blow across the earth, and the waters subsided. The Hebrew word here for remembered is different than you might think, and it's important to note this. Remembered doesn't suggest that he had forgotten it. This remembered has more of a notion of deciding to act. So it's not like he forgot. It's just that now God acts, and he blows a wind across the waters. Again, God is in control. Unlike most of the pagan gods in other flood stories, when they unleashed whatever horrendous flood or rain or whatever, they were often powerless to do anything about it. It just had to work its course. So the Torah makes the point over and over that there are no nature gods, only the God of the Torah. Pagans were not stupid people, we don't think, or I certainly don't think, but they had never been exposed to any such suggestion that maybe until now with the Torah that there was maybe a one true God and all that sort of thing. The Bible is theocentric and anthropocentric. It's not animal-centric. It's not nature-centric. And interestingly enough, as the theocentric view collapses, man becomes lesser as well. And some of the people who I follow, like Carl Sagan and Stephen Hawking, tend to add to this diminishing thing. In fact, Carl Sagan said something like, how insignificant man seems when he's looking up at the heavens or something. And Stephen Hawking said something about men being just a collection of atoms and particles. I think it's a little more than that. And certainly if you're a believer in the God of the Torah, you would think more than that. So that in the 7th month, on the 7th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. And the waters went on diminishing until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the 1st of the month, the tops of the mountains became visible. Now, at first blush might look like some sort of a contradiction in timing, but it really isn't. The fact that the ark touched ground or came to rest in the 7th month, at that point where the bottom of the ark hit ground, there would still be 30 more feet of water above that point at the bottom of the ark that would need to be evaporated away, or however the water diminished. And it could easily have taken a couple, 3 months for that to happen. So running aground is a considerably earlier event than the entire ark being out of the water. And at the end of 40 days, it's not the same as the 40 days of the rain. This is the 40 days at the end of this 10 months-ish period. Noah opened the window of the ark that he had made. Never again will I doom the earth because of man, since the devising of man's mind are evil from his youth, nor will I ever again destroy every living being as I have done. God vows not to curse the earth again. Doom actually means curse. The Hebrew word doom could easily have been translated, never again will I curse the earth. This is not implying God regretted what he did. And also it's interesting to note that free will was not abolished. You would think that God might have decided that free will wasn't a great idea, but that's not the case. He's sticking with that notion. So how does God prevent a relapse in evil? More revelation is the short answer, and we will see more of that as we proceed through these first couple of books. This was the second attempt by God to impart good. The first thing he did in creation was put a conscience in man. We talked about that a little bit. The second thing he did was produce these Noahide laws, meaning the laws of Noah that were set forth as the laws of Noah. And then the third attempt will be the Ten Commandments at the end of the Exodus story. And God makes it clear that if earth is ever destroyed again, it will be by man's hand, not by God's. That should give one pause. And this is a unilateral covenant, interestingly enough. Man does not have to do anything in return for what God is promising. It's unilateral. Let's see, I'm trying to see, there's a question here. Oh, did it? So is that something that God just needed to do? In those 11 months, he decided to not do it again. Well, you know what? It is interesting. If you have time to ponder things, you might come up with different notions of how it went. And 10 months would be a long time. I'm not sure that is the case here, but it's an interesting thought. Okay, moving on here. God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fertile and increase and fill the earth." The exact same words were spoken to Adam and Eve in the garden. We're starting again here, just like we started anew, or started in the first place with Adam and Eve. We are all descended from Adam and Eve and Noah, who was a just, innocent man. Noah, if you're not familiar with the ancestry of Adam and Eve, Noah descended from Seth, not from Cain. So we can't be charged, if you will, with being descendants of a killer. Cain's descendants were all destroyed in the flood. Have many children. Now this is the second time that we've seen this command or instruction. Repopulate. Most other pagan stories, and here's another big difference, go exactly the opposite way, thinking that overpopulation is the problem, not the answer. And this command is followed in 5 verses by the human population. Today, there are nations at risk of not surviving because they are not reproducing at a sufficient rate to replace themselves. And you can sort of line that up with secular approaches to life. All that exists is material during this brief lifetime. Why mess that up? Why mess up enjoying all that material greatness or fun or whatever by having children to deal with? And it's true that rarely are children easy to raise. But, I mean, literally, it is to your own nation's peril if you don't repopulate. Noah, the tiller of the soil, was the first to plant a vineyard. And thus, in a moment, and we're not going to go over all these verses of this little mini story at the end of the flood story. Thus, the cautions regarding alcohol start here in terms of the Bible. Noah planted a vineyard, presumably making wine. And this is the only thing we know about Noah in the 350 years or after the flood. This event that sort of puts a cautionary thing out for the dangers of alcohol. And it's not going to be the last one. I mean, even in our little course here, we will see not very far down the line, Lot sleeps with his daughters after getting drunk. So, and interestingly enough, the way alcohol is treated in the Bible has led, or presumably has led, at least it's true that historically low rates of excessive drinking and alcoholism exist among the Jews. They're not particularly prone to that problem. Another thing that, let's see, where was I? Prager points out is that if you're focused on good and evil, then the comparison of the dangers of cigarette smoking and the dangers of alcohol don't seem to be emphasized the right way. I think you could fairly say that our society, anyway, has come down hard on smoking and secondhand smoke and all this sort of stuff, but not nearly as hard on alcohol. And while both do cause disease and death, it is alcohol that causes far more evil, such as abuse, rape, homicide, drunk driving, deaths, etc. So it's possible we don't have the right amount of focus on each one of those, perhaps. In verse 21, which I don't have listed here, the story continues that Noah becomes drunk and falls asleep naked. And Ham, a son, disrespects his father by doing something. We don't know what that was. It doesn't say what it was. And then showing whatever that was, or showing his dad to his brothers. That's all we know of the story, but it does hint at the importance of being careful with alcohol. Then Noah curses his son, Ham, in what appears to be a kind of an unfair way. He curses his Ham's son. It violates, among other things, the principle of not punishing children for the sins of the father, for the parents' crimes. So, for whatever reason, he really came down hard. Now, the 26th verse, and he said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. Let Canaan be a slave to them." I mentioned the word slaves up in verse 25 as well. And some Christians and some people point to this as some sort of justification for black slavery, particularly based on verse 26. And they argue that Ham was the father of the black race, and therefore blacks were cursed to be enslaved. And I would point out, as Prager does, that that's particularly vile notion and particularly baseless as well, for a couple of reasons. The Torah in no way suggests that Ham was either black or African or anything about his ethnicity. The other thing is that Ham is not the one who's cursed here. It's Canaan. It's the land of Canaan. And three, God is not participating in this curse. Noah is doing the cursing. So anyway, I thought that was interesting. I'd never heard that argument leveled about supporting slavery somehow, but there you go. These are the 7 Noahide laws. I thought I'd just list them here for you. We're not going to talk about these a lot. You will see many of these as we go through, culminating in the 10 Commandments. No idolatry, don't murder, don't steal, don't engage in sexual immorality, blah, blah, blah. They would sound familiar. The important thing here is at this point in the narrative, there is no such thing as Jewish or Hebrew. So these laws, the Noahide laws, are intended to be universal. All of mankind should be held to these. And these come not all exactly extracted from the Bible. There's a thing called the Talmud in the Jewish world. It's basically all the Jewish thinking that has gone on reading the Torah and the rest of the Old Testament and so on. And they have added to, that's where the 600 and however many laws have been put together that they think were outlined in the Old Testament. But they're not necessarily spelled out in the Bible either at this point or even at all. The first 6 were given to Adam and Eve, though number 6 about eating animals wasn't exactly applicable. And the last 2 in the covenant with Noah were added then. This is another thing that was different about the Noah's story in the Old Testament. This is chapter 10. The whole of chapter 10 is really this lineage thing. This was revolutionary. It's the only ancient text to enumerate such a thing, the ancestry, the descendants of Noah. What's the point? The God of the Torah is the God of all nations, not just the Hebrews. The Jews are intended to be a blessing to all nations. And that should be to the benefit of all those other nations, is the point. It's not the Jews are special or chosen. I know they use the word chosen, but that's not what it means. They are to be a blessing to all nations. They should do good for all nations. And there's 70 nations in here. 7 times 10, remember? Important number. And it also aligns with the number of Abram's seed at the end of Genesis going into Egypt. So it is, at least here, quite consistent with the next book that we're about to enter into. Okay, a little brief stuff about the city of Babel. This is chapter 11. We tend to only remember the Tower of Babel, but God's issue wasn't just with the tower. God's issue was with the whole city. And he, as you'll see in the verses, if you read them one by one, he refers to the city of Babel, and sometimes he says, and the tower, but it's almost always the city. One of the big truths here, big does not mean important or even relate to importance. The tower was big. They thought that was important. It wasn't. In 11:4, verse 4 of chapter 11, the people wanted to make a name for themselves. And this starts an area of thought where the Bible cautions you about fame. One of the most often answered responses to what do you want to be when you grow up is famous. I want to be famous. Well, the cautions are there for you. Fame will likely die with the owner, you. It's fleeting. The more you value fame, the more crushed you are when it's gone or unattained. This is a good one. There is little more pathetic than watching someone try to retain fame. I've actually cringed for people watching that try to happen. And true fame is really only available to a very tiny percentage of the people. In verse 5 of chapter 11, the Lord came down to look at the city and tower that man had built. You can't miss the irony here. They were building something up to the skies, but God had to come down to look at it. That's pretty good. And they stopped building the city, not just the tower. The city. The city is the issue. The story is, among other things, warning against human hubris and and often immoral nature of cities. It's a caution about cities. The bigger the city, the more anonymous you can remain, and by that avoid responsibility for things. Of course, cities have their pluses and rural areas have their negatives, but in the balance, the Bible warns us that cities are more of a moral problem than not city areas. And the Torah is all about morality. It's not about science and art and lots of other things, a lot of those other things that do seem to come out more of city life than out rural life. But the Torah is about morality. And when it comes to morality, cities present a problem. Okay, so let me, before I launch in here, let me turn things back on so we can ask any questions or do that sort of thing. Okay, so we're back. Everybody's live if we're going to jump in here. Next week we do Abram through Joseph, and I want to re-emphasize that we're going to start going much, much faster. We've taken 3 sessions to get through 11 chapters, and next week the material that we're looking at covers 38 chapters. They're not large, but still. So we're obviously going to be focusing on the big truths as we go through, not verse by verse. So are there any questions or comments?
Yeah, actually, I have one. Hello. It's Alice here.
Okay.
What about those 600-year-olds and those old people? Talking about these divine beings, the Nephilim, and these giants. What about Bigfoot?
Well, I hadn't thought about Bigfoot. I don't know how it relates to the X-100-year-old.
Well, I'm thinking of anthropology and not Bible-based research, but research anthropologically about these thoughts, these ideas about giants or entities exist culturally around the world.
Huh.
Like the Philistines.
Yeah, I don't know really, but you're right. There were certainly giants in other stories.
I just thought it was interesting. The notes on my questions there relate to that.
Jamie, I have a question. This is Karen speaking.
Yes.
Early on, there was the determination that God had determined that the people were no longer going to live into multiple hundreds, but that 120 years would probably be lifetime. So when does all that come about? Because up to what we're reading, we're still living to 600 years. So
yeah, that's
is there more later?
Well, I don't know what will come from here. So far, all the ones that live to be up to 900 and something predate this. So at this point, God says, no, nobody's going to live that long anymore. It's going to be limited to 120. So maybe we'll stumble onto older living people in Exodus and so on. I just don't know at this point.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
So, Jamie, this is Barbara. Are we going to finish Genesis next time then?
Yes. When we do Abraham through Joseph, that will be it for Genesis. And then the following week, or I forget exactly when Labor Day, we skip Labor Day Tuesday, we'll go to the Exodus, which is in Exodus.
Okay.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Here I am. Can you send us just a separate copy of the genealogical chart of the descendants of Noah that you used?
Yes.
So we can look at it more closely?
Yes. As a matter of fact, I as a matter of course, post both the recording of this session and a PDF copy of my slides and notes, and that chart will be in there.
Yeah, it's just that so much good information on that one page, but I couldn't capture it fast enough.
Yeah, it is interesting. I must admit, I barely recognized any name on it. They were all sort of unknown to me mostly. That doesn't tell you anything one way or another, but I thought it was interesting.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
I have another question, Jamie. This is Karen. In kind of reading later in chapter 9, from the Talmud, there was an implication by Prager that some Jews would argue against the death penalty and some would not. Do you know what how are we to understand that?
I don't know offhand. As you know, in society as a whole, and in a lot of segments of society, like the Jewish world, Christian world, whatever subset you want to talk about, there's a great deal of debate about capital punishment. So shouldn't come as anything surprising. Prager's position is clearly pro-death penalty.
Yes, he is.
He can't imagine how a God could be just by allowing some premeditated rapist / murderer to live. But that's his opinion. You can interpret things differently, I suppose. Did that answer your question?
Are there different Jewish sects or something that have a more liberal kind of view over that, and perhaps other things?
Yes, definitely. Now the Talmud, I think, is a common document, regardless of what group of Jewish people you belong to, Orthodox or liberal or just plain secular. The Talmud is a thing. There aren't multiple Talmuds. And it's basically, like I mentioned, it's the biblical commentators, rabbis, Jewish folks down through the ages that have decided on an elaboration, you might say, or a condensation of what is actually in the Old Testament Bible. In other words, here's what we think Jews ought to understand once they have read the Old Testament.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Now,
Good
Jamie,
job,
if I
Jamie. That's great.
Go ahead, Barbara.
if I can't get onto the website now, will I be able to access your notes?
Yes. The notes are just a link on the web page at the church website, the God is Good page.
Oh, okay.
And just look under...
okay, so we go to the church website.
Yeah. Yeah, that's where you find a link to the recording
I got it.
and so on.
Okay, thanks.
Uh-huh.
Hi, Barbara. It's Alice.
Hi, Alice.
I miss you, Barbara.
I miss you too. Thank you, Jamie. This was very interesting.
Thank you,
Jamie.
You betcha. And we'll see you all next week.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Alrighty.
Bye.
Bye.
Good luck with this.